I was standing 3 feet from the fireplace in Lord Cavendell's library when I heard a man claim a woman's life's work as his own, and I remember thinking, with the particular calm of a man who has seen too many drawing rooms and too many frauds, that it was one of the most brazen things I had witnessed in 40 years of diplomatic service. The evening had been arranged to celebrate the Beltrain Accord, or rather the English translation of it, a 15,000-word document drawn from 4 languages, dense with legal precedent and the particular treacheries of diplomatic phrasing that have undone more treaties than war ever has. Lord Cavendell had convened perhaps 30 of the finest minds in London, ambassadors, secretaries, men of the Foreign Office, a scattering of lords whose titles came with actual consequence. The translation had arrived that morning, bound in Morocco leather, and the room agreed it was masterful, precise, elegant, the sort of work that appears only once in a generation. "Remarkable effort, Harwick," said the Prussian envoy, raising his glass toward a man standing at the mantel, a fleshy, self-satisfied fellow named Mr. Cornelius Harwick, who served as secretary to the Foreign Office, and who had, as I well knew, no more than schoolboy French and a smattering of Latin. Harwick smiled and dipped his head. One does what one can for king and country. I watched from my corner. I had been watching the room's far edge, where a young woman sat with a small notebook in her lap, her posture entirely still, the stillness of someone choosing not to move rather than someone who has nowhere to go. She was perhaps 22, plainly dressed in dove-gray wool, her dark hair pinned simply, her hands folded now around the notebook as though it were a thing she might need to protect. She had been introduced to me earlier in the evening as Miss Alara Voss, companion to Lady Cavendell. No one else in the room had spoken to her. Several had looked through her. When Harwick accepted his 3rd compliment, this time from a man whose ministry had spent 6 months awaiting this document, I saw Miss Voss close her eyes for the span of a single breath. That was all. Then she opened them and looked at the fire, and her expression was the most disciplined thing I had seen all night. I knew then. I did not yet have the proof, but I have spent 40 years reading rooms, and I knew. It was the Duke of Aldbury who supplied the proof, though I do not think he intended to do it so publicly. He had arrived late. Aldbury always arrived late to civilian gatherings, as though he needed a moment outside the door to remember how to move among people who had never been afraid of him. He was the most formidable man of my acquaintance, not merely titled but genuinely feared, a negotiator whose silence had ended 2 minor conflicts, and whose written opinion on the Treaty of Breshold had caused a minister to resign. He was not warm by nature, he was precise. He noticed things the way a surgeon notices, and he did not forget them. He took a copy of the bound translation from the side table, turned directly to page 47, and read for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he walked to Harwick. "The subordinate clause on page 47, he said, without preamble. "The Hessian conditional. The original uses a form that carries a threat of sanction forward into the next paragraph. The translator has caught it. No English secretary catches it without knowing Hessian case law." He held Harwick's gaze. "Where did you study Hessian case law, Harwick?" The room went quiet the way rooms do when a fire is suddenly extinguished. Harwick opened his mouth, and what came out was a sound rather than a sentence. Aldbury waited 3 seconds. Then he turned, not toward Harwick, but toward the room's edge, toward the chair where Miss Voss sat very still, and he looked at her with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not accusation, recognition. "Miss Voss," he said. He said it the way a man says a name he has been turning over in his mind. "You submitted a paper to the Linguistic Society 2 years ago, on the conditional forms of the Hessian Diplomatic Register. It was published under the initials E.V. Every head in the room turned toward her. She did not flinch. She met his gaze with the directness of someone who has spent years preparing for a moment they expected never to come. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "You speak Hessian." "I speak 7 languages, Your Grace. Hessian, French, Italian, Dutch, Portuguese, classical Latin, and enough Russian to be dangerous." The faintest note of dry precision in that last phrase. Not a jest, not bravado, simply accuracy. Aldbury set the bound document on the table beside him, precisely the way a man places evidence. "Then this translation is yours." It was not a question. The Secretariat required a male name on the submission, she said. Her voice was level. Mr. Harwick agreed to lend his. I looked at Harwick. He had gone the color of old wax. "Agreed to lend his," Aldbury repeated. There was something in those 4 words, a compression of temperature, an entire verdict delivered in the most measured possible register. That made 2 men near the fireplace take a quiet step backward. He turned to the room at large. Let the record of this evening note that the Velterrain translation was authored by Miss Alara Voss, whose scholarship exceeds that of any person in this room, myself included. Someone started to speak. I do not know who. Aldbury did not look at him. He crossed the room to where Miss Voss sat and stood before her, and then, and this is the part I have told at every occasion since, because it deserves to be told, he offered her his hand. Not a polite gesture toward a door, an open hand offered upward, as one offers it to someone one intends to escort to the center of a room. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it and stood. He turned them both to face the company. The ambassadors, the lords, the men of the Foreign Office, the Prussian envoy, and one very pale secretary whose career had just ended quietly in Lord Cavendel's library, and he said, "Gentlemen, I believe you were thanking the wrong person." What followed was the longest silence I have witnessed in 30 years of diplomatic salons. Then the Prussian envoy, to his considerable credit, began to applaud. Others joined him, slowly, then all at once, the sound filling Lord Cavendel's library while Harwick slipped toward the door unwatched. Miss Voss did not bow to it. She stood straight-backed and let the room see her at last. I have thought, since that night, about what it cost her to sit in that chair for the first half of the evening. She had known, from the moment Harwick accepted his first compliment, that the next hours would pass without acknowledgement. She had calculated, with the same precision she brought to Hessian case law, that protest would accomplish nothing, that a woman's objection in that room would have been reframed as confusion or jealousy and dismissed in the same breath. So she had sat still and she had waited, and she had trusted that the work itself would eventually speak. She had not counted on Aldbury. None of us ever counted on Aldbury arriving exactly when he should. I was present 2 months later when he called on her at Lady Cavendel's house, alone, and asked whether she would consent to serve as the primary translator for the next set of treaties. Under her own name, with her own terms, with a formal appointment from the Foreign Office that he had apparently spent 6 weeks engineering. She had looked at him for a long moment before she answered. "You did not do this out of charity, Your Grace," she said. It was not an accusation. She was reading him the way she read a text, looking for the conditional forms, the clauses that carried meaning forward. "No," he said. "I did it because the ministry cannot afford incompetence. And you are the least incompetent person I have encountered in 2 decades of treaty work." He paused. "I also did it because someone should have done it years ago, and I was not paying close enough attention." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a very honest answer. I find honesty saves time." She accepted. I was best man at their wedding the following spring. The ceremony was small. Aldbury disliked ceremony for its own sake, but the signing of the register afterward was the moment I remember best. She took the pen and signed her name in her own hand, in full, in the clear and unhurried script of a woman who has learned that her name belongs on every document she authors. He watched her sign it, and his expression was the same one I had seen in Lord Cavendel's library. Not surprise, not triumph, just recognition. The look of a man who has finally placed something he had been trying to identify for a long time and finds it exactly where it should have been all along. She looked up at him when she finished, and he said very quietly, in what I believe was Hessian, something I was not meant to hear. Whatever it was, it made her smile. The full, unguarded smile of a woman who has stopped expecting the world to overlook her. I have seen many things in my years in service. Negotiations that changed the map of Europe. Men who said magnificent things in public and believed none of them in private. But I have seen very few moments I would call just, in the plain and old-fashioned sense of the word. Moments when the right name is written on the right page at last, and the person holding the pen knows it, and so does everyone in the room. Alara Voss became the Duchess of Aldbury on a Tuesday in April, with rain on the windows and ink still faintly on her finger. I thought it the most appropriate detail I had ever observed at a wedding. She had earned every letter of the name.